Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Nice to see you all. Well, I can't see any of you, actually. My name is Bert Biscoe. I'm the chairman of Truro Civic Society, and I've been chairman off and on for too long. So if anybody wants to take over, you're very welcome. Tonight, we're going to embark on what I hope is a series of talks on Zoom by people who have, one way or another, a professional interest in aspects of the conservation design, planning, and general appearance of Truro, past, present and future, which is essentially what the Civic Society is about. We're a membership organisation and you're very welcome to join. And if you're interested in joining, if you contact the email address that you applied to for the link for this tonight, we'll let you know how to do that. It's very simple. So tonight we've come to hear a talk by Rob Lacey, which is about the heritage relationship between heritage management, heritage conservation and the planning system in Truro, with specific reference, I think, to the Neighbourhood Plan. In 2004, Rob Lacey got married twice, once to his wife and second time to Truro, because that was when he first took up as the group leader in the planning policy team at Cornwall Council, with responsibility for Truro. And I think that in the ensuing almost 20 years, he has developed an expertise around Truro and a network of relationships, and he's got several achievements under his belt, not least shepherding the Truro and Kenwyn Neighbourhood Plan into existence. The Truro and Kenwyn Neighbourhood Plan is, I think, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, neighbourhood plan in the country, and it does involve a partnership between Truro and the parish of Kenwyn, the two parishes, the parish of Truro and the parish of Kenwyn, which again, in terms of neighbourhood planning, is quite unique. However, the metropolis, which is Truro, reaches that greater Truro, as Stephen Watson used to call it, the late Stephen Watson. Greater Truro does extend to embrace 3 Milestone, and Truro College lies out there, and Truro Hospital all lie within the parish of Kenwyn, actually. So it was natural, good sense to create a neighbourhood plan for the whole conurbation, as it were. And poor old Rob has been wrestling with all the problems that arise from having two authorities driving one neighbourhood plan, with the diversity of the issues and the aspirations of Kenwyn, which is essentially a rural parish, and Truro, which most definitely isn't, although it's got a very strong relationship with its natural environment. And so I think his take on things is actually, 1, bespoke to Truro, 2, very knowledgeable of the planning system, and 3, tempered with a great deal of pertinent and current experience. So man worth listening to, I think. I should just point out before we start that the talk will be recorded. If you don't wish to be included in the recording, if you stay mute and blank, then you will not. You'll hear the talk, but you won't be present in the recording in any way. As I say, this is one of a series, and I hope that the second talk will feature representatives, the principals of a company called My Loki, who are currently supporting the development of the Towns Fund project at Boscawen Park, but whose company started out in Truro by incorporating a man called David Burma, who was the man who designed Lemon Quay. A man who famously once said, "Never do anything in a town that you can't undo because you might want to change it," which I think is a very wise statement for a town planner, a town designer to be taking on. Just setting us on our way, I would like to thank 3 people who've been instrumental in getting us to this point tonight. One of them is Edwina Elbers, who is on here as Damien Richards. And we'd like to thank Truro City Council for access to their Zoom account, which enables us to hold this meeting. Hence, Edwina is Damien. Ian Hibbard, who is the webmaster. Please do visit our website, www.trurocivicsociety.com, who has dealt with the bookings and so on, and is an energetic and really lively generator of activity for the Civic Society, to whom we are all immensely grateful, and to Caroline Jones, who's the treasurer, who has fielded a lot of the bookings and made sure that all the wheels are oiled, all the oils are wheeling. Therefore, without further ado, and just bearing in mind that we have to get Rob and Edwina to do the shared screen sharing thing, can I welcome Rob Lacey, and can I welcome you all, and I look forward to fielding your questions in between 20 and 30 minutes time. So please make a note of any queries or questions that you wish to put to Rob. Okay, so over to Rob Lacey. Ta-da!
Thank you, Bert, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I can't promise to follow the excitement of that you've been promised, but I'll start sharing my screen now. And hopefully, everybody can see that screen now. But is it all? Yep. Right. Okay. So I'll start the presentation. So this evening, I'm just going to tell you a little about the situation for planning generally. I'll tell you a bit about the Truro Neighbourhood Plan, how it was produced, what it aims to do, talk around some of the challenges specifically around Truro and for heritage in Truro, and then a bit about the process of updating and revising the Neighbourhood Plan. There's some space for questions there, and I'm quite happy to answer as many of them as I can. So heritage and planning is a little at the crossroads at the moment. So there is, as you may have picked up from the media, apart from the fact that we had yet another Secretary of State for communities and local government, as of today, that planning reform is mooted. We hear very vague rumours that we're going to hear about that any day soon. It may not be after today's announcements. But also alongside that planning reform, there's a fairly wholesale reform proposed for heritage and the way that we deal with heritage in planning. So that will soon become apparent, as I understand it. There's also the introduction of new permitted development rights, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. But those are starting to change the landscape and what can be achieved through planning and through our plans. The other main challenge that we have is our changes to the way that we live and work. So things have been changing in Truro before COVID, and certainly after COVID, as our shopping and our leisure patterns and how we live evolve. 18, 20 months ago, I didn't ever imagine that I'd be working at home every day, and that the wholesale changes that we've seen would have happened. But vibrancy and innovation is going to be required to keep our places sustainable and thriving in the immediate period, but also into the future. And I think COVID has acted as a bit of a lens as our world has shrunk through that period to identify some of the things that we really value and issues that some of our residents across Cornwall and in Truro had. So particularly, I think things like access to green spaces was very apparent, the size of people's homes, how they live, whether they were able to work at home, and how their support networks functioned. And certainly I know that a lot of our rural areas in Cornwall really changed over that period. They became very inventive about how people moved around, how they got goods, and it started a process of change that we're watching with quite interest. Alongside this, then, we've got the climate and biodiversity emergencies. Those were declared in 2019 by the council, and an action plan was prepared and published in that year. It's clear, I think, that there's a threat from climate change and the need to change how we live our lives that planning is having to pick up. In Truro, that's been manifest as elsewhere in more extreme weather events, more intense rainfall events, more intense heat. And it's continuing to impact now and will do so into the future. And that is a big part of the work that my team's involved in now, is planning for climate change and understanding what we can do alongside our carbon neutral Cornwall colleagues and colleagues across the council. There's continued housing pressure, and I think that's really come to the fore. It's part of it's one of the biggest priorities for our new administration in the council, but it is something that's been evolving for a long time. That pressure has been building, and it will require quite considerable inventiveness about how we deal with that, if we're going to deal with that and not cause other issues. And then we have that changing approach to heritage. So positive strategies being developed for Cornwall's heritage by our heritage strategy. And that's started to recognise more and more the evolving nature of our environment and the threats and opportunities that are presented by that. And a key part of that is around climate change, adapting to new uses for our historic assets and the evolution that's required to help protect them from extreme heats and flooding and give them sustainable futures. So a little bit about planning, just really my very poor diagram to explain. So we've got national policy at the top of the pyramid. And I've chosen a pyramid deliberately because as you get further and further down there, you get greater detail through the plans. So the national policy sets out the operating framework for Cornwall Council to create its Cornwall local plan. And that plan is very strategic, covering the whole of Cornwall. And we rely very much on neighbourhood plans to be providing the detail that's needed for decision makers to make decisions that are recognising local issues and to get that diversity that we see across Cornwall. And neighbourhood plans really do help to fill in the gaps and set out the important issues for planners to use. And there's considerable latitude in that. So working through the neighbourhood plans as we have as a team, we are starting to see real diversity of those, lots of interesting policies coming through. And it's helping to achieve some things that we didn't think we could through planning. So the Truro and Kenwyn Neighbourhood Plan, and it's always difficult to know exactly how much people know about this, so hopefully I'm not labouring it too much. But a neighbourhood plan is a plan that's developed for and by the community. And it was brought into the ability to do these was brought in by the Localism Act in 2011. And that for the first time then gave communities an opportunity to create a statutory planning document. So this is very different to the parish plans that we used to deal with, because once a neighbourhood plan is adopted, it then forms part of the local plan. So it's used for planning decisions and has full weight. It's a material consideration. It was developed by the City Council with a number of partners and communities in Truro. And these plans are subject to at least 2 consultations. The first plan went through a number of consultations and a number of processes to make sure that it was engaging the community. And it's very much a point of time, I suppose, for Truro. It was developed in the period before the local plan, before the Cornwall local plan, when Truro was faced by quite considerable development pressures. And there was a real pressure there to get a plan in place by the community and to make sure that what was seen as gaps in detail from the Cornwall local plan were then dealt with for Truro. And it followed on from a lot of work and reference that I've been working on planning issues in Truro since about 2004, previously with Carrick, And we've had a number of attempts to put in place a plan over that period. And this really was the first plan then to be put in place to start marshalling the arguments that need to be made for development quality and where development is placed. There were some difficulties with that, of course, because at the time, because we didn't have a local plan agreed, we didn't have a housing number agreed, there were a number of developments that were difficult to resist. So the resumption in favour of sustainable development, national policy was in place. So we saw big and controversial decisions over that time. So things like Langarth, Tolgerrick and Copperfields, and High Newham. All those sort of big applications that were put into place that are now incorporated into that plan. The plan covers housing, employment and open spaces, heritage, education, the sort of things that you would expect to see in the local plan. And in terms of relevance, I think, to the Civic Society and discussion this evening, then you've got in there some more detail about the city centre. So thinking about the situation that the plan was put into place, so it was a generally full city centre, so very little vacancy. There's a burgeoning number of out-of-town retail proposals. And I think that plan, even in that point, people were recognising that change was already on the horizon. There was pressure to start rethinking how the city centre is planned and the uses that are contained there. And so that had already started that discussion that now fuels how we deal with the revised plan. It was recognised at the time as well that there were a number of redevelopment proposals and a real pressure to make sure that when those came forward, so big sites like the former Carrick offices at Pydar Street, and sites like Old County Hall, how those would come forward, how they would contribute to the life and community of Truro was covered in that plan. It also planned for a diversity of uses in the towns, but also getting down to some of the detail about shop fronts, the appearance of shops that have previously been covered, but then wasn't covered in sufficient detail. It also helped to put in place the conditions for the use of the Conservation Area Management Plan and provides context for the local list that I'll speak about in a moment. But of course, all things have started to change around that, and that has very much led the revision of the Neighbourhood Plan that we have seen at the beginning of last year. So we've seen quite considerable change in patterns of work and leisure and shopping. So a lot of attitudes that were changing before COVID that have been hardened by COVID. So the loss of a number of national chains, the way that people shop, so that online shopping has become a fixture of modern life, much more than we're anticipating and at a greater pace than was anticipated. That now there are a number of permitted development rights that have been put in place by government. So one thing that came into being at the beginning of August is what's technically known as Class MA, which is a permitted change of use. So normally, for those that aren't terribly familiar with planning, you would need to apply for a change of use to turn, say, a shop into a house, or to change between different uses of shops. And it was something that we used to be very exercised about in planning. So things like preventing concentrations of particular uses in city centres and town centres. So at the time that I started in planning, it was all about estate agents and building societies. Which it's no longer, because I can't remember the last time I saw a concentration of those. What's happened now is that a lot of the changes between different types of retail, different office uses, different service uses now, they don't need permission. But now from August, there's a new right that even in conservation areas, but not in listed buildings, if a building is vacant for 3 months, the owner of the building can now essentially carry out a change of use of that by just letting the council know, and we have a certain number of days to respond. If we don't respond, we don't ask for further detail, then essentially they can change of use of that. So that will have potentially a huge impact and will start increasing the number of residential units, both above shops, but also at ground level. Now in conservation areas, we do have additional controls over that, not to resist necessarily the change of use or the principle, but to ensure that we're getting the right mixture of uses at ground floor. So that's something we've recently, as a council, provided a note on, and it'll be a discussion that we start having with neighbourhood plan groups and parishes and town and city councils that have significant high streets. That is partly, I think, a response to loss of retail over COVID, but also government's attempts to resolve the housing crisis, provide more flexibility in the residential market. So there will be a lot of that change. We've certainly seen a significant uplift now in applications and permitted development being taken up to change upper floors of shops that, frankly, in my career as a town planner, I haven't seen before. We've been trying for years to get people to convert over shops. That is now happening at quite a pace. Climate change is our other big challenge. As a council, we have a climate emergency development plan document that we've been working on over the last 18 months. That is now going to full council of Cornwall Council on the 28th of September, and that includes then policies around diversifying town and city centres, about increasing densities where that's appropriate, bringing people back into city centres and addressing some of the trying to get increased diversity, more residential presence in city centres, and also provide a guide as to how neighbourhood plans and other community organisations and business organisations can start planning for diversity in their shopping areas. Also very much around reusing historic buildings, and the mantra being that a building that is kept in continued use will survive much better than a building where alternative uses are resisted. So there will be an increasing flexibility, and what we're seeing is that there are more and more of those permitted developments being put into place. That will reduce control, but plans like Truro can really start to set out their stall about what they want from their town centre, from their city centre, and use that to start promoting the sort of uses they want. So on that note, the neighbourhood plan, and I've been working with the group on this, and that was really taking opportunities, I think, to look at what had changed in Truro over the period that the plan had been put into place, and starting to recognise that there were significant schemes. So the significant scheme at Pydar Street, I meant Langarth. So both Langarth had stalled. The housing permissions were very significant housing permissions, and it was recognised at that time that the neighbourhood plan really could then get into the detail of reshaping those planning applications as Cornwall Council became more involved in the drafting of new plans and master plans for those sites, and in some cases getting involved in the purchase of land So the Neighbourhood Plan group has worked alongside making sure that the conditions are put in place to create a sustainable and urban extension at Landgarth as can be possible. And the same with Pydar Street, being engaged in those discussions. Built on those challenges that I outlined a moment ago, there's flexibility put in place in the city centre. So already talking about divergence of uses, but also having a think more fundamentally about what the city centre should be and the conditions for allowing redevelopment or reuse. The plan puts in place better building standards, so really starts to talk about the layout and taking opportunities for energy efficiency, green infrastructure, and more accessible layouts in redevelopment. It's provided the hook for the local list and the means of consulting on that. I'll say a little bit about that in a moment, but also recognising how the wider plan area and the heritage of the wider plan area needs to be taken better into account in decisions. So picking up the issue about significant trees and boundaries and impacts those have both on the conservation area, but on the heritage, and really articulating the story of Truro, the disused leats, as you move away from the city centre, the hedges, the fields, have all then contributed to the landscape work that will guide future planning decisions and is helping to guide the decision about where the urban extent of Truro is fixed and used in planning decisions. So the local list, what that means, so a local list is a formal instrument. So it's something that can be adopted by a local planning authority as an addition to the formally listed buildings that we have. So it's an advisory document that's designed to safeguard aspects of the built heritage which are deemed to be locally valuable. And that means that structures can be included on the local list that are of architectural merit or particularly important to the area, or have a story or association with something that's locally valued, but don't necessarily meet the criteria for formal listing by Historic England. So that may be a landmark, or it might be an area that particularly contributes to the area. I now live in a locally listed house, but my house wouldn't be listed in the formal list. And that's followed a process. It was instigated by the Civic Society with the City Council and developed by the late Patrick Taylor, who researched and wrote that. And it's a really interesting volume that tells us a story about the heritage of Truro. In the planning world, those buildings are then described as non-designated heritage assets. Not terribly catchy, but it then means that it starts to help out in planning decisions. So the harm to non-designated heritage assets are then considered in planning decisions and have to be weighed. If you're going to cause that harm, just like a listed building, there has to be really significant public rather than private benefit to that. So a really important step forward in recognising the diversity of buildings in Truro that may not have been formally listed, but very much that narrative of how Truro has evolved, making sure those buildings and the spaces are protected in decisions. And then just drawing to a close, really, just to say that also, whilst that's been going on, as a council, we've been further putting together a design guide that we expect to publish in October. That's a mock-up of what the final product may look like, but that is very much built around understanding the distinctiveness of Cornwall. So it sits with my heritage colleagues' local distinctiveness approach that we've been working with a number of plans on. It will provide very specific guidance around materials and appropriate forms And it's a negotiating tool, really, for planning officers to better understand the challenges of achieving local distinctiveness, which is particularly important in places like Truro and as we get closer to conservation areas, but also contains things that might have been missing before around shopfront guidance, and also now that we're starting to see applications coming in to change ground floor uses from retail to houses, to start understanding what the most appropriate response to that is to conserve the heritage of the building, but also to provide good living environments. Alongside government reform, we now have design codes that at a national level, part of that work will developing design codes that help guide planning applications at a local level. So, final slide. So what lies ahead? Well, the big thing in my profession, the proposals for change to the planning system, very, very tight-lipped. We're not getting anything out of MHCLG, out of the ministry at all on this, but we do anticipate that either we'll get absolutely no change at all, really, or that there's going to be quite radical change, and planning will lurch to this new system of land allocation. And from a heritage perspective, that will see change in the system, but also that built up areas like Truro could well then sit within the renewal zones that we're seeing, and some protection zones that will then have a new set of rules that we're actually getting used to understanding. Design coding already exists. That came into being last month. We're now starting to think what that might look like, how we might deal with design coding to address things like climate change, better design, more characteristic design, and we're just working on a pilot at the moment about engaging with neighbourhood plan groups on starting to understand at a local level what needs to be done to shape better decisions. The climate change development plan document will be submitted, we hope, after September's council, and that will start to then set out that range of policies around adapting buildings, mitigating against climate change, densification, reuse of brownfield land, and starting to really think about how we make the places we live more sustainable. We're also just on the journey of starting a document that will go to Cabinet this month called Prosperous Cornwall, which will start to provide an overarching strategy for Cornwall, and a spatial approach, so to start to describe what we might need to take into account next time we start writing a local plan. So that will start to set out our plan to 2050 and as far forward as we can go. So general principles about how we need to start developing a plan that takes into account things like climate change and the other big challenges that Cornwall has in the future. And I hope finally that we will have a neighbourhood plan referendum for the revision of the Truro and Kenwyn neighbourhood plan. So with that, thank you for your attention. A little bit over time, I apologise, but I'd be quite happy to take any questions or comments that you have.
Rob, thank you very much indeed. I'm just desperately trying to find where the raise hands thing is on this.
It's reactions at the bottom.
Oh, reactions. There we are. Oh, there we are. So if you would like to ask a question, perhaps you could hit the thumbs up in reactions or raise hand, and I'll get to you. So whilst maybe you just collect your thoughts, perhaps, Rob, I could just ask you a question, if I may, just to kick things off. I think that it's always the case, isn't it, that if something appears to be going wrong or needs a bit of tweaking, we take an action which promotes some change in one direction, and that of course always has a consequential set of reactions elsewhere. And it seems to me that Truro in particular, because it basically re-engineered the transport infrastructure in the 1960s, had a very successful retailing and service-based town centre economy. And that there are no real indications of that's going to change terribly much. There will be some closures and maybe some constriction, but I think things seem to be on a fairly even keel. And I'm just interested to know whether as a planner, and whether planners in general are thinking that actually in allowing these flexibilities and these conversions of buildings, bringing buildings back into use, doing different things, and particularly bringing people back to live in the town centre, which I think is vitally important, that at the same time we don't lose those attributes of the town centre, of the economy of the town centre, which people place great value on, like its compactness, like the fact that you've got several different versions of the same thing, so you can do comparison shopping. You've got a cohesion to the town centre, and of course that enables people to be directly engaged and more competitive, and therefore the sort of the edge that customers want to feel is there is actually able to happen because of the environment in which it's operating. And I just wonder how you feel that we are trying to ensure that we don't throw the retailing baby out with the conversion residential bathwater.
Yes.
See what I mean?
Yeah, and it's a real challenge, I think. If I'm honest, I suspect that the permitted development right may not be used an awful lot on ground floor retail in Truro, because Truro is one of those places that has remained quite viable. There's still that vitality, and it's pleasing to see that new businesses are going into those vacated shop fronts. So it will be very much, planning is a very blunt tool to deal with things like retail markets, and it's the permitted development rights are even blunter as a tool, because they try to they're trying to take uncertainty away for planning applications and for people to convert buildings. But that in itself then creates uncertainty in the market, because it might push the town centre in one particular direction. What we don't want to see, and I think the town funds work and the approach of the climate emergency document and indeed the neighbourhood plan is trying to see that diversity, and not to lurch from one thing. So a very retail dominated place that's then dominated by housing, or starts to lose its edge, or dilute what people come into centre. So certainly I think some of those freedoms will allow other uses to start creeping in. See some of the bigger units get carved up and turned into a number of other businesses, but it's difficult to see how we could really totally resist some residential, and that will be a good thing. But I think the important thing will be having a very clear strategy.
That's right.
For towns that says what they want to be, and starts pushing that towards, and works with landlords and owners and other people to start shaping it. So I think the future will depend on how engaged people are and how vibrant a community, a city centre community is.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to ask Heather McPherson, followed by Fiona Fleming. So Heather, you're muted at the moment.
Hi, my name is Heather McPherson. I've just got a couple of questions. You've been talking about the changes to the upper floors of shops continuing with your previous conversation, what does that mean? You said you've seen there's a significant change in the numbers of people, of landlords who are requesting the changes to the upper floor of their shops. What does that mean in actual figures or numbers? How many have you seen?
Well, I'm not sure I could give you a number at the moment, but we are starting to see a number more applications. And certainly it's not something, and particularly in Truro, that we've seen an awful lot of directly in the city centre. But I'm aware of a handful of applications now. Previously tried, we tried an awful lot of different things to get people to do. We offered grants, we offered all sorts of things in the past, and we didn't get any take up really. But I think the economies now have changed. The market is in a state now where it's actually worth doing for a lot of people.
Okay, thank you. It was interesting because you used the word significant change in the numbers, and it's a handful at the moment. So how are you planning to extend that knowledge, I suppose, expand that knowledge to people?
So we each year as a council, we prepare a monitoring report that's doing that. We are also just about to commission a piece of work that looks at opportunities to further promote reuse of vacant buildings and upper floors, and also to put in place frameworks who can monitor what's happening, what the impacts of those are as part of our future planning process. So there will be information then available to really get a handle back what this is doing, because each of those, whether they make a planning application, whether they use permitted development right, they have to inform the council of what they're doing.
Okay, Mr. Biscoe, can I ask a couple more questions of Mr. Lacey?
You have.
I can.
Well, can I go to Fiona Fleming and then come back to you, Heather? Is that all right?
Of course.
And ask any others if they wanted to come into the discussion. So, Fiona.
Oh, hi. I'm Fiona. Thanks for inviting me along. I hope you can hear me. My internet connection's not
Loud and clear.
Brilliant. That's amazing. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a landscape archaeologist. I work with Cornwall Archaeological Unit. But I also live in Truro, so I've got a vested interest in planning and heritage in particular, obviously. I've always been interested in how towns have developed historically to respond to varying sort of social changes and pressures. So it's particularly interesting at the moment to hear, Rob, all your ideas of proposed changes and possibilities for the town. But my particular question is concerning the permitted development that you're talking about. Part of my job is doing some of the many impact assessments that feed into planning, obviously with heritage involved. And I'm just wondering, with permitted development, if there will still be mechanisms that allow for the normal conditions that you would perhaps consider as part of the planning process to protect any sort of historic buildings and any mitigation that might be required as part of the development, even though it's permitted, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it's, well, this is something we can have some, I think there are some standards around how permitted developments are. So for this one, it's in technical terms, so there are normal permitted development rights. So if for instance, you want to put an extension on your house and you met those rights, you could go ahead and do that without binding permission. This new right, they have to notify the council. We have a certain period within which we can go back. For conservation areas and ground floors of conservation areas, there's an additional requirement that they have to look at the potential impact on the appearance and sustainability, and character, and the sustainability of the conservation area, which I think everybody currently is scratching their heads about. Quite knows what that means. Historic England doesn't know, tell me what that means. And we have some ideas about what it means, but it's going to be an interesting one about that. Think about how a conversion can take place in a historic building without and respect those features, and then whether we can condition particular elements of that, and particularly around archaeology, it's slightly unclear at the moment. So we are working with Tamsin Daniel's team, so the strategic historic environment team, to start to unpack what that really means and how we can deal with that particular aspect.
Obviously, the mitigation, normal mitigation, historic building, and just monitoring any changes that take place. You know, that sort of facility would be useful to kind of retain if possible.
Indeed, and what it doesn't do is it doesn't give them planning permission to carry out any changes to the building, so external appearance, which is I think why we're likely, actually, rather than seeing a lot of permitted development rights being used, that we'll see a lot of planning applications because they're far more flexible, which will then, of course, allow us to impose those conditions. But they'll be using the permitted development right to say, well, I could do it, but I'm applying for permission. So there's a slightly delicate dance to be done on some of those issues. But I suspect what we'll find is a lot of people end up applying for planning permission because it's far more flexible for their users.
Yes, yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting to me personally. I wonder if I could ask, excuse me one moment, but I wonder if I could ask Fiona on behalf of the Neighbourhood Plan a question. And that is that over the last 40 years or so, we have been able to do significant excavations, particularly around the edges of Truro. So the Tregarra Park and Ride site, for instance, or the Truro College site, and Richard Lander's site, and so on. And of course, the first great excavation was Charles Thomas digging up, doing the Trelisk Hospital site. Charles Thomas held the National Health Service back single-handed for 6 months while he investigated Iron Age burial sites. Good man, hero. And but the point being is that all these reports from all these digs, actually, if you put them all together, I've been in a very privileged position for a long time in these terms, but I don't think that we've really got a narrative based on the archaeology about how what we now know tells us about the evolution of the town. At Tregarra, on the Park and Ride site, you've got evidence of industrial activity going back into the Neolithic period, including farming, and that actually roots Truro in a slightly different way, and it roots Truro in a different set of economic drivers than perhaps we consider today. And just thinking about climate change for a minute, it seems to me that some of the things about resilience, self-sufficiency, local making, utilizing materials in a sustainable, all those sort of things which are going to come, that actually understanding our archaeology is a really good way of understanding what our opportunities are as well. And I'd just be interested to ask you if you know of or think it would be a good idea, particularly as part of the Neighbourhood Plan process, to actually develop an historic narrative based on the archaeology that we now have available to us.
Well, there certainly isn't an overarching kind of story, as you say. They do, everything exists in its kind of respective reports from the various bits of work that have been done. Obviously, you've got things like the CSIS, the Urban Survey, that does give a good narrative and good development of the town up to the point it was written. And of course, there's been a lot of work since that happened. So there's probably a lot more that could be added to that. It would be a really useful thing to have. I mean, my position, obviously, working with the archaeology unit, is that we're a commercial unit. So everything that we do and produce is done with a commercial remit.
Yeah.
Can't just we don't just have the niceties of being able
Which is
to.
why I think it would be useful to do it through neighbourhood plan, because we may be able to commission it.
Well, that something like that we could certainly do. I mean, it's part of what we do as on a general kind of day-to-day basis, but we always do it serving a commercial master, if you like. But we could certainly look at doing something like that, and I'd be very happy to sort of have further discussions about that and feel that back to the team and see what could be done. Absolutely.
Okay. That's a bit of an opportunity interjection on my part there, so thank you very much for that. So I guess come back to Heather, who's got a couple more questions. I think Heather McPherson.
Oh, hi. There's actually going to be a huge display, I think, in Truro Museum about the heritage of Truro, isn't there? From October through to November, I think. I walked past it the other day. How much power does planning have with regard to the frontages, the exteriors of buildings where clearly the landlord has abandoned or isn't actively preserving their building, Mr. Lacey?
That's an interesting question. Well, it depends on how bad it gets, I think. The general maintenance side of it, there's a real question about when the intervention is required. So if we take the ultimate action, then you serve a section 215 notice through enforcement, and so that requires the owner of the building to undertake repairs, and is linked very much to a really negative impact on the amenity of the area. The authority can, in some instances, go in and do work and put it on as a land charge, so it sits with the land registry, and anybody then purchasing the building subsequently ends up paying for that work to be undertaken. But in practice, there's an awful lot of negotiation or cajoling that goes on in these things, but it is because it is really quite difficult to get people to do things to their buildings. And I think a lot of the things that have been done to external appearance of buildings in the city centre, for instance, have ended up being initiated by other organisations, because they've gone in and things like examples of taking cherry pickers around and cleaning people's gutters out and things like that. But there are an awful lot of buildings in the city centre that are owned by people that perhaps don't ever come to Truro, or that they're remote from. And it is an issue that I think planning is badly set up to administer, because it doesn't really get into that, particularly for an authority of this size, that it's very difficult to get to the point where you can do something legal, a sort of a legal imperative for somebody to improve the building.
Okay, I mean, I've discussed this with Mr. Biscoe before, and I don't know if you had the opportunity, Mr. Biscoe, to walk to the back of the buildings that I was talking about, which were by the side of the cathedral, next to the Methodist church that used to be next to the old post office. I think they were very important historical building. Did you go to?
Yeah, I've had a quick nose around in there surreptitiously.
Yeah, and what was
I didn't get caught. I have to say that I agree. I mean, I feel that one of the things about heritage management and heritage awareness is that we always look at things that we can see from easy vantage points, and we always look at the front, because that's the bit we see normally from the street. And actually, to me, if we're going to do this business, we're going to do conservation, we should do it in depth, and we should do it thoroughly. And that means that we look at the whole building. A listed building is not just a facade. A listed building is the whole building. And I've seen some exceptional examples of people who've set about conserving buildings in an holistic and multi-dimensional way. So, for instance, the Mansion House in Princes Street is a really good example. Or further down the road, I'm not sure that I know the name of it now. What used to be Hancock and Lawrence, and Ennis's Bank. I'm not sure what it's called. But they spent a huge amount of money at one time refurbishing that building and bringing it back to its almost original condition, but with technology built into it that would sustain its condition, which is so some monitoring and so on equipment that's been put in there. So it's a really good piece of work. And on the other hand, I've seen if you go into High Cross where you were talking about, and you look at what was the public rooms, which have got the rondels of David Garrick and William Shakespeare up on the wall there. You know, if you look in through the window, you can see the steel frame of the office block that lies behind it. And to me, that's awful, dreadful. Now to talk about, so I'm a big fan of going and having a look at the backs of buildings. I really like walking up Lemon Mews Road, for instance, and having a look at the backs of the buildings in Lemon Street. I think there's some really intriguing and interesting pieces of architecture up there. And I agree with you that in the back of that, behind the old Marks and Spencers there, the Chantry is the building you're talking about. You are looking at something which is actually left over from all the land clearance that went on to put the cathedral in there. And it is a remarkable survival, and it's a very interesting building. I agree. I also think that if you go and look at from what they call the Riverside Walk, as you turn off New Bridge Street by the bridge there and go down through Furnace Island, and you just take a glimpse along the backs of the buildings going down New Bridge Street from there, I think there's some really interesting features down there that we ought to be looking at and conserving. Really, you know, some of it's quite colloquial, but then to me, the great beauty of towns is that mixture of style and colloquialism, which, you know, gives it the rich diversity. So yes, I thank you. Yes, I've done that, and yes, I did have a look, and yes, I'm not being able to do anything about it. I'm not sure there is anything to do about it. I'd really like the cathedral to repair their boundary wall, which got knocked over by a tree. That would be good.
The lease. Final question, Rob, Mr. Lacey. When are you going to sort the leaks out?
Well, that's not Rob's problem. That's
Is that not right? He did mention the leaks.
That's Truro City Council's problem, and I'm the vice chairman of the Parks Committee, so I'm the vice responsible for it. The answer is that we are currently engaged with the Environment Agency in a discussion which will enable us to move what is called the RAM pump, which is a pump which lies in a chamber under the leats at the bottom by the front gate of Victoria Gardens. And we want to move it up next to the weir so that we can use that pump, which operates, it's a wonderful piece of technology. It operates under its own volition on a centrifuge, and it's a brilliant thing. And we want to move that up to there and use that to feed the water out of the river and into the leats. We had a problem which arose some years ago with the Environment Agency, who were just insistent that we should reduce the level of what they call a header tank. And when they reduced the level of the header tank, which they insisted on doing, we stopped having the water pressure to feed the leats. And so this is a way of dealing with that issue. And as far as I know, we're at a fairly advanced stage in those discussions. And we've got a resource available to actually move it once we've got the consents in place. So it's a live issue.
That's fantastic, because for me, that's a huge heritage point of view.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Lacey. That was a very interesting talk, and thank you, Mr. Biscoe.
So Fiona Fleming, you're coming back.
Just as a brief comment really on what you were saying, Bert, about the backs of buildings. From my point of view, the backs of buildings are often where the best information historically
absolutely
still survives as well. Yeah. So as much as we all kind of admire the frontages, actually we can get an awful lot of information and enjoyment from the backs of buildings, which are often overlooked.
If you're out in the town, again in New Bridge Street, if you come off the Riverside Walk into New Bridge Street, you come up by the Polish delicatessen there, the Polish shop, and it's really, I think it's really fascinating. If you look on the side of that shop, there is the most grand Georgian doorway on the side of the shop, and you've got to ask yourself why whoever owned that building put such a grand piece of architecture on the side of that shop, because and the answer is because it was the river that he was looking at, and the river was the main street, I think. So Susan,
perhaps it was because of all of the rubbish bins down the side of that walk.
Oh, well,
that he wanted to have a look at.
no, I agree with you about that. Well, we're trying our damnedest to get a shot of them, and we have got quite a lot of them into the compound that we built on the other side of the road. Susan Coney, you had your hand up. And then it wasn't up. Are you there? Here we go. No, you're still muted. Have another go. There we are.
Right. In answer to Heather's question or comment that the Royal Cornwall Museum are doing an exhibition about Truro, yes, they are. It was delayed. It's now delayed until November, as far as I understand.
Right.
And the reason why I know is I've been helping remotely with it.
Oh, right.
So I hope you find it interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
They hold an awful huge amount of stuff about Truro.
They do. They do hold an awful lot of stuff. It's been very difficult to try to keep it reasonable because, as you know, they haven't got an awful lot of staff at the moment. But I'm doing my level best to help them. The lady who's doing it is called Margaret Morgan. She's in her 90s.
Gosh, really?
Oh, yes.
Fantastic, Margaret is. She's
in her 90s. She knows an awful lot about the museum and their artifacts they have there. She's virtually doing it on her own, but unfortunately she's not fit enough to hang everything.
Oh, right.
So yes, unfortunately it will be there.
Yeah.
A lot of images from the museum's archives, including artifacts from the museum artifacts.
Yes.
And yes, so it will go ahead, but it's been delayed till November. But I would encourage people to go and have a look because they've got some incredible stuff. So
what you're saying is that Margaret Morgan is curating this show.
Correct.
Well, in that case, I would absolutely, totally and utterly commend everybody on the planet to go and look at it, because if you want to find out, one, what's in the museum and find out about the town of Truro, she's the woman who knows where everything is that can tell us. Fantastic.
She certainly knows where everything is in the museum more than anybody else.
Yeah.
For people who don't know Margaret, as I said, she's in her 90s.
Yes.
She used to be the teacher of French at the high school for many years.
Yeah. Yeah.
She knows more about what's in the museum than anyone else, I would suggest.
Yeah.
Her and Angela.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I would say to you, I sincerely hope that these feature in this exhibition is that Truro, the Royal Cornwall Museum has got a significant part of the collected drawings and paintings of Christine Oates, who was the art teacher at Truro High School when Margaret Morgan was the French teacher.
Yes.
And those people who've seen those A4 black and white street by street guides to historic Truro, Christine Oates did the vast bulk of the illustrations for those, and she was a wonderful portrayer of features and buildings and groups of buildings. An excellent artist, and I hope that we see some of that in the exhibition.
I don't honestly know. It depends on how much room they've got. I have all the booklets that she illustrated.
Yeah.
So it will be there. She's done her level best to put things on, the most fascinating little things that she's got out of the archives.
Yeah.
One thing, Fiona, if I might say, when I was doing some research some time ago, I found an article in a newspaper that said when they were building the now public rooms in Quay Street that became the Palace Cinema.
Oh, right, yeah.
What they call the Palace buildings.
Yeah.
When they were excavating underneath the road, which is there now, they found a very ancient old road, which was cobbled.
Charles Thomas's Road.
Correct.
Charles Thomas's medieval road, which he had archaeologists over at Marks and Spencer's prodding around in the ground and the mud for months trying to find. They couldn't find a cobble.
Well, no, but it wasn't there. It was the
No.
other side of the quay. So it's where the outside the palace
Right.
building, between that and the old mansion house.
Right. Ah.
That makes a lot of sense. I have got to give my apologies and dash off because my tea is ready.
Yes. We're all very
Don't
pleased to
stop.
hear that. So listen, thank you very much. It would be very good to stay in contact with you, particularly around getting a narrative together. And I hope Rob's made a point of that, made a note of that. Sorry.
Do get in touch with me. I've got to cancel emails, so.
Yeah, okay. All right, we'll do that. That's lovely. Can I thank you very much for contributing this evening, and thank you for coming. Is there anybody else who's got any questions that they want to put to Rob Lacey, who actually gave the talk? Anybody? 5, 4, 3.
Yes,
Peter. Hello, Peter.
I've lived and worked in Truro the last 50 years, a long time since the Civic Society. A lot of people wonder why Truro turns its back on the sea and the estuary. Is there much support for doing something about Newham? Perhaps having more residential and leisure use there rather than industrial.
Did you catch that, Rob?
Yeah, so it's a question about why Truro turns its back on the river and the estuary, and the lack of residential accommodation facing the river, I think.
Yeah.
I think, and I know you've got a view on this as well, but I suppose that's essentially, where, as I understand, where part of Truro's come, that we've ended up, I suppose, with those industrial estates taking up land that was previously used as quays and as part of the port. I think, as I understand it, there is a project certainly around the Gareth Wharf area as part of the town deal to have a look at, explore that and providing access to the river. I think is something that we've always, certainly was always a challenge that was brought up as part of plan making when I worked for Carrick. It's really, I suppose, just a historic. It's something that's just in place by people that own the land adjacent to it, and I personally, first preference, I think there's probably quite a lot that could be done there, particularly around Tesco and Gareth Wharf, that could address the river better. It's been a lack of opportunity, essentially, to get people to do that, to move that, and I don't think there's anything in the neighbourhood plan that would prevent that from happening. It's a will to do something about that. Sorry, I think the signal gave in at that point.
Sorry, I was muted. From my point of view, there are two key issues around this which are really important. The first one is that if you look at the history of Newham has been an industrial estate since about the 11th century. It's an older settlement than Truro. And it has always been industrialised. So there are historic narratives which describe the Bedrugan family, who were lords of the manor, early medieval warlords. When they wanted enforcement crews, they used to come to Truro to pick up posses of Truro tanners from their manor of Newham, because they were the toughest, nastiest guys in Cornwall. and they would go around and do their enforcement and whatever it was that they wanted them to do. So it's got a very long history. I think also as part of that, if you look over the other side where you've got the bakery and the West Britain building and so on, you've seen a significant refurbishment and a quite an imaginative architectural scheme which has conserved a lot of those warehouses running down the Malpas Road and put some new build in there in a very sensitive way. And actually, you know, that group of buildings has retained a character which is you know, a distinctive part of the narrative of Truro. And I think I mean, I think it's important to say that there's a lot of work, a lot of income, a lot of innovation, a lot of enterprise actually goes on around that area already, and we need to bear that in mind. I think that there are some bit unattractive bits of it, and you're right about the Town Fund project. It is attempting to address improved commercial opportunities around that area, and that's all to the good, I think. But the second point I would make is that we have to bear in mind that what created the post-war prosperity for Truro was a huge re-engineering of roads that took place in the 1960s. And part of that put in a bypass. Truro, of course, ended up calling their bypass an avenue, but a bypass it is. And that the creation of that bypass removed from the town centre the huge bulk of traffic that used to use the A39 that used to pass through Boscawen Street. And that we have benefited from that, and the rear servicing and so on, which has been put in, the inner distributor roads around the edge with the car parks on it and so on. The whole town has benefited from that. And that basic infrastructural provision is still the foundation of the town centre's commercial and economic prosperity. And I think that one of the issues about that is that we have to accept that that road, dual carriageway running through between the two roundabouts, is one of the most important assets, infrastructure assets that we have, that actually keeps the centre, the environment in the town centre, relatively car-free or vehicle-free and clean and a good trading environment. And that therefore I have seen proposals to put zebra crossings across it, which would be utterly ludicrous, not to mention dangerous. So part of the problem with the waterfront, as they call it, is accessibility. That the only way we're really ever going to continue to be able to get there is by using the subways, unless we want to mess up that infrastructural provision or do something different, like a bridge across the river half a mile downstream, which I don't think is likely or possible or indeed affordable. So there are some issues around it. But as you say, the Town Fund project is attempting to address some of the ones around Gareth Wharf in particular, where there is opportunity, I think. Does that help everybody? Is that all right, Peter?
Yeah, I really had in mind further down river, a town park, sunny corner of Reading. On the other side is a street.
Yes. Sorry, Rob, did you have something you want to say, Rob?
No.
No. Okay. So thank you, Peter. Thank you. Susan Coney.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
Right. I just like to say I do understand what Peter is saying, that from Boscawen Park and the cricket club,
Yes.
looking across, it does look a bit of a mess. However, I think I was really quite pleased when we had the new boatyard there, which is employing a lot of people.
Yes.
And it's a great sort of tradition to carry on within Truro with boat building.
Yeah.
And also, yes, you know, it does look a bit of a mess, but, you know, how else are we going to provide some industrial work for
Absolutely.
people within Truro? It is a difficult question to make it pretty to look at, but provide employment for certain trades.
And value, I have to say. I mean, one of the things. I mean, it may not. Truro is actually the second largest cargo handling port in Cornwall after Foy.
Yes.
And what makes it that is pretty much the scrap metal. And the scrap metal is one of the major contributions to waste management that actually produces the sustainability profile for Cornwall. So it's got benefits, and as you say, it's got to happen somewhere.
Yes.
You know.
And it is interesting when you are at Sunny Corner or Mulber's Park on a high tide and you see the big ship come in to take away the scrap metal. Yeah, scrap metal in a big bulk, huge by the side of the river is not pretty.
No.
But it is interesting when you see that little bit of history that's still there.
Yes,
There's a big ship coming up to take things away from the port of Truro and out through the Foul.
Yeah.
I agree with
you.
What we can do to make it prettier, I have no idea. I'll leave that up to the expert planners.
Well, I think keep the planners out of it. Sorry, Rob.
Thank you very much, everyone. Susan, thank you very much for that information about the museum. That was really great to hear. Mr. Biscoe, thank you for inviting me. Edwina, thank you for helping with all.
Well, Heather, I have to say that the letter that you wrote to the Civic Society has prompted us to be here this evening. So thank you very much.
Oh, good. I'm so pleased to hear it. I'm really, really pleased. I think talks like this are so invaluable.
Just before you go, I should just say that the next one is scheduled to be on October the 27th. On October the 20th, I beg your pardon, and as I say, will involve the principles of My Loki. So we will make sure that you get an invitation to it. Everybody will, and we hope to see you for. So just before we all pack up, perhaps I could just thank Rob Lacey for his stimulating and wide-ranging talk, and thank you very much. And you stimulated a lot of discussion, which is extremely good. And thank all of you who've taken the trouble to come this evening. And if you've enjoyed it, please do tell your friends, and so we can draw more people towards us for the next one. Thank you, as I say, to all the people who've contributed to making it happen, particularly Ian Hibbard, Edwina Elbers and Caroline Jones. And I think that means now that we can call things to a close and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.